So let's begin this class really from where we left off last week with the Bronze Age collapse, and let's look again at the Near East, at Mesopotamia. So during the 9th and 8th centuries BC, the Middle East was in a bit of a slump after the Bronze Age collapse, right? So invasions and famines had left cities very small and struggling. But then around 721 BC, the Neo-Assyrians or New Assyrians burst onto the scene with some serious military tech. They had iron weapons, skilled archers, wheeled chariots, and cavalry, and they were on a mission to revive the long-lost Akkadian Empire of Sargon of Akkad. And so they were led by the formidable, as he called himself, Sargon II. The Neo-Assyrians then conquered through him this massive territory, again kind of reviving Sargon's old empire. But their empire was much more massive than Sargon's. Their empire stretched across Armenia, Babylonia, the eastern Mediterranean, Israel, and even parts of Egypt. So Sargon II, inspired by David's Jerusalem, decided to build a new capital for himself called Du-Sharrukin in 713 BC. This move really allowed him to avoid existing political conflicts, right? He wasn't the foreign overlord of a foreign city. He was the overlord of his own built city and kind of create the perfect city to embody his rule. So Du-Sharrukin was this groundbreaking city design, the first outside Egypt to adopt a strictly orthogonal plan with very geometric streets, right? It featured, nearly square walls enclosing an area 4 times the size of Ur and twice that of Hattusha, with walls rising up to 12 meters high, studded very regularly with guard towers. And then the gates were strategically placed on opposite sides, suggesting a grid of perfectly straight streets within the city. So this is really the world's first perfectly square orthogonally planned city, which we're going to see a lot more of throughout history as we go through this class. Sargon's Grand Palace, which you can see in the left-hand picture, stood impressively at the northern walls of the city, guarded by these massive shidus, these colossal winged granite figures over 5 meters tall. They kind of look like griffins. But the palace complex wasn't just for Sargon. It also included secondary palaces for all of his advisors and all of his extended relatives. So visitors would have approached the main palace via this ramp designed for chariots, leading to these 3 grand portals, each guarded by these pair of enormous shidus. Once past these formidable shidus, you'd enter into this expansive first square court, spacious enough to accommodate thousands of courtiers. The city's layout followed a strict grid, but the inner palace had this unique asymmetrical entrance to prevent direct access. To the north of the first court were the bureaucratic offices for running the government, for keeping tax records, and a small passage would have led to a smaller court of honor, about half the size of the first one, where you would have a chance to meet Sargon himself. Turning left from here, you'd enter a suite of throne rooms. One of the reliefs under a throne depicted Sargon triumphantly driving his chariot over fallen enemies, while his men behind him collected skulls, showcasing the Neo-Assyrian Empire's very violent prowess. But the throne room's thick mud walls would have been adorned with stone friezes of the king and his courtiers everywhere, hunting and waging war. As you can see, this is a very war-proud empire. But really, the entire palace was constructed with unbaked mud bricks and palm trunks. So the rooms were long and narrow. They could not be any longer than the length of a palm tree. Right, so he really wanted to throw up this palace quickly, and this kind of contributes to why it has such a poor survival today for archaeologists. Inside the rooms of the palace, it would have been quite dark, with the main light sources being the courtyards scattered throughout the palace. And the western side of the complex finally featured 6 temples and a very unique 7-level spiral ramp ziggurat. So yes, they are still using the ziggurats in this time period after the Bronze Age. In the end, this city really only existed for a single generation, because after Sargon II's death in battle, his son Sennacherib abandoned the city and chose to rebuild Nineveh as his capital. But despite being abandoned, Sargon's architectural feat redefined the concept of the city as the grand stage for a godlike ruler commanding a formidable war machine. From Sargon's grand architectural achievements, we see a legacy of cities not just as centers of power in the Middle East, but as grand stages for rulers who envision themselves really as godlike figures commanding mighty empires. So the early Iron Age here saw a quick succession of rising and falling empires in the Middle East, and the successors of the Neo-Assyrians were the Neo-Babylonians, a relatively short-lived empire, but one of the most enduring in the minds of people because of its frequent mention in the Bible. So let's fast forward to the 500s BC, where we see the Chaldean dynasty, the head of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, breathing new life into Babylon, the city of Babylon, establishing it as the heart of their empire. You know, the Euphrates River ran directly through the center of this bustling metropolis, which under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar II transformed into a diverse Iron Age city, home to kind of an estimated 500,000 people speaking as many as 20 different languages. You know, much like the Neo-Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians took hostages from conquered lands for their construction projects in this city. And this period is particularly important in Jewish history. It's remembered as the Babylonian captivity, when the Jews were taken captive after the destruction of their first temple in Jerusalem. We talked about this in the last lecture, and this is where they ended up. This is the city, and these are the projects that they ended up helping build. Interestingly, Babylon housed 43 temples for various deities, including one for the Jewish captives. So let's look at the architecture a little bit. So Babylon's outermost walls were made of incredibly durable fired bricks, doubling the city's size compared to Sargon's capital, and obviously a lot more permanent. You know, these bricks were so well made that they were even used in rebuilding much of modern Baghdad. They've lasted that long. You know, legend has it that the walls were even so wide that 4 chariots could race side by side atop them, hosting these thrilling and dangerous elevated chariot races. In the center of the city, in the center of Babylon, this grand axis, this grand street stretched through the city walls, leading to the new enlarged palace and major temples. They even had daily religious ceremonies held along the processional way, which just added to the city's vibrancy. This grand avenue, flanked by the royal palace, eventually connected to the major temple complex in the city, the Grand Achaemenid Ziggurat. So around 570, Babylon rebuilt their grand ziggurat, the original of which was thought to have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. And the biblical interpretation, if you're not aware, kind of portrayed the original tower as an embodiment of human hubris, an attempt to sort of surpass the gods or surpass God. It was built, you know, according to the Torah, to reach the heavens and achieve fame for the people of Babylon. But this second ziggurat followed the design of Ur-Nammu's ziggurat, with this kind of triad of stairs leading to the first landing, if you remember from the second lecture. The ziggurat was then enclosed by this grand wall, 400 meters on each side, containing housing for the priests and grain silos for the taxes within its thick walls. And its footprint was 91 meters per side, almost twice the width of Sargon's tower, and 25% larger than Ur-Nammu's, doubling the height. Babylon's new ziggurat had 7 stages, each painted allegedly a different color, symbolizing the 7 heavens or the 7 planets, a significant concept in Babylonian astronomy. And despite being 1/3 smaller than the Pyramid of Khufu in Egypt, it was considered then the tallest building in the world and inspired massive awe. After Nebuchadnezzar II's death, though, Babylon faced massive discontent over its high tribute taxes and internal disputes. And so the nomadic Achaemenid dynasty, originating from Persia, eventually took over in the chaos and established the largest empire yet, spanning from the Indus Valley to the Nile Valley, including Turkey, the Ionian coast, and Macedonia. Finally, in 539 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia defeated the Babylonians at Babylon, beheading the old dynasty and naming his son as the new governor of Babylon. They even made it one of the administrative capitals of their now massive empire. And according to one account, Cyrus, during his siege of Babylon, diverted the very course of the Euphrates River so the Persian army could just wade across and march under the walls straight into Babylon. When the smoke cleared, the empire was divided into 20 semi-autonomous states ruled by local what's called satraps, governors, and the Persian king held the title King of Kings, overseeing the entire federation. This warrior emperor Cyrus first founded Pasargadae as the new capital near his original birthplace in southwest Iran, designing it with a sort of scattered layout that reflected the Persian dynasty's nomadic roots as pastoralists. I kind of imagine it like the Dothraki city in Game of Thrones. It showed this transitioning dynasty from pastoral life to a more settled civilization. And the capital had this really informal design with these stone structures spread out in this lush park-like setting, surrounded by defensive walls and probably surrounded by the tents of the Persian army as well. It had a massive gatehouse, it had these very lush gardens, it had a palace for Cyrus, it had a fire temple for Persian rituals. But it was really merely a diplomatic capital for subjects of the empire to come visit and pay tribute to Emperor Cyrus. The architecture here was understandably a blend of a lot of different influences owing to the mere scale, the mere size of this massive empire. The palace and audience hall had a kind of Mesopotamian style Orthodox design, but also included these Greek-like colonnaded porches and an Egyptian style hypostyle hall. This mix reflected the Persian Empire's ability to integrate all of these diverse cultures into the architectural style of their capital, because they didn't really have their own architectural style. They only had tents previously because, as I said, they were previously a nomadic people. But then Darius I, who succeeded Cyrus's son, abandoned Pasargadae and built a new Persian capital called Persepolis to strengthen his rule. And so Persepolis was started in 518 BC and featured this kind of grand palace complex set against steep cliffs enclosed by mud brick fortifications. So the same idea here as before. This is a palace complex. This is a capital that diplomats and sub-kings will visit to pay tribute and deliver messages from across the empire. And Persepolis was an absolute marvel of design, again pulling all of these architectural elements from across the empire into one representative ruling building. So it had sculpted Assyrian monsters, it had Mycenaean crowfoot crenellation, it had Egyptian cornices on the edges of buildings, and it even had Greek Ionic columns. So visitors would have reached the palace through this extraordinary set of switchback stairs adorned with reliefs showcasing the empire's diverse ethnicities, depicting, bearded sub-kings and ambassadors from all around the diverse empire carrying tribute to the king, to the emperor of the Achaemenids. And this specifically was called the Narwuz Festival, this annual festival at Persepolis, where these provincial representatives, these sub-kings, these governors, demonstrated their renewed allegiance to the Achaemenids by traveling all the way to Persepolis bearing gifts. So travelers reached Persepolis via these stone highways typically constructed by the Persian regime, linking 20 of their provinces all the way from Turkey to Pakistan. So really the purpose of this complex was to serve as a grand repository for tribute coming from across the empire. and the festival began with them filing in a great line into the gateway of all nations, this kind of room guarded by Assyrian-style shidus, and on the other side of the room the visitors then crossed a court to reach a second ramp with bifurcated stairs adorned again with reliefs of sub-kings carrying gifts for the king. This ramp led directly to what's called the Apadana, Darius's massive audience hall that could accommodate up to 10,000 visitors. The Apadana featured 36 tall wooden columns to hold up the roof, painted in very vibrant colors and supported by these decorative double-headed bulls. In contrast to the dark interiors of Mesopotamian palaces, Persepolis had well-lit square rooms with interior columns holding up the ceiling, reflecting very much the nomadic roots of the Persians, looking much like the interior of a tent. Of course, on the outside, these colonnaded verandas on three sides of the Apadana's exterior really resembled the facades of Hatshepsut's terraced mortuary temple, which the Persians must have seen and copied, looking to enhance the grandeur of their own capital. Xerxes, Darius's son, then added his own touch to Persepolis around 480 BC with the Hall of 100 Columns, and this new throne room was kind of located just behind the original Apadana on a slightly lower platform to give reverence. And so this Hall of 100 Columns, this massive square hall, really matched the dimensions of Darius's original Apadana, but was even more grand with 100 stone columns arranged in rows of 10. And these columns were very reflective of the diverse people that the Persians had rule over. So they actually had Greek fluted designs in the column itself, but the capitals were both Persian and Egyptian, featuring clusters of Egyptian lotus buds, which you regularly find on columns in Egypt. But then above these capitals you have these double-headed Persian kneeling bulls, which formed notches to support the ceiling rafters. And so between these two hypostyle halls stood another monumental gate, providing access to the private palace zones. And so architects here arranged chambers for the king, his sons, his royal harem, and the treasury in parallel bands, kind of extending toward the southern wall. In the 6th century BC, Greek city-states began to emerge on the edges of the Great Eastern Empire, and these city-states developed unique forms of self-government for the first time, with Athens standing out for its extreme dedication to democracy. Unlike the autocratic systems of the East, the Greeks preferred generally rule by public assemblies and councils. And so instead of grand palaces and hierarchical temples like those in Egypt, Assyria, and Persia, Greek cities often featured open public spaces with a few colonnaded structures for civic gatherings. This reflected their emphasis on public participation and community involvement. In addition, the fragmented geography of Greece with its hills, its coastlines, and its many islands kind of encouraged the growth of these independent, self-managed cities. And this environment really fostered specialization in maritime trade and shipbuilding, leading really to the establishment of colonies and vibrant debates about urban planning farther afield than Greece, right? A lot of these Greek city-states had colonies in Italy, in Turkey, and on many of the other islands around the Mediterranean. As far as architecture goes, this is the period where we get to developing proper, what you would recognize as Greek classical architecture. And Greek classical architecture is, known for its proportional composition and decorative elements like sculpted columns and tablatures and pediments, which we're going to learn about today. And this became the cornerstone of Western architecture. This architectural style really contrasted sharply with the sort of more monumental and rigid designs seen in the grand complexes of Persepolis and other Eastern empires. The Greeks' approach to city building and governance beginning here really left a major lasting legacy that influenced Western civilization for centuries. So Athens especially was crucial in developing Greek architecture and urban planning, especially in the 5th century BC. During this period, the city expanded from the Acropolis to what's now the Agora, which you're looking at now, underneath the Acropolis on the flat lower plain, marking a shift from, a Mycenaean fortified hilltop to a democratic public space. So the Acropolis originally had been a Mycenaean megaron and a fortified palace, but in contrast, the Agora below, meaning gathering place in ancient Greek, became this central public area in Greek cities. It was a key spot for citizens to debate, engage in civic activities, vote, and contribute to law discussions. So, let me just go over very quickly, very briefly, how this new experiment starting from Athens of democracy really worked. So, beginning in the 5th century BC, we really start to see the opening up of the ability of the citizenry to directly participate in the running of the government. So, Athens was not exactly the kind of democracy we think of in the West here. The citizens of Athens didn't vote for representatives to install their leaders in the government like we do today, but the entire citizenry voted for all of their offices directly. So with an election, anyone who's a great speaker or someone who's particularly wealthy could become politically powerful at any time, and all offices were held by rotation, meaning these fixed terms, and typically a limited number of terms, with the exception of the general, the strategos as they called it. For instance, Pericles, a certain Pericles, was elected to be general some 15 times. And in order to take a part in public life, to make a part in government decision making, you had to be a citizen. And in order to be a citizen, you had to be male, and you had to be Athenian in this case. However, if one citizen was seen to be usurping power, the citizens could vote to ostracize him, and he would have to actually leave Athens for good. This was a reminder that there were a lot of checks in place against any one person assuming too much political power. So how was this Agora, this center of Athenian government, actually used architecturally? So this is really a space that started out as a place for markets originally, as a place of buying and selling, and gradually during the Archaic and then the Classical periods became a place of government with administrative buildings and also some sacred spots as well, some temples, although the primary sacred spot was, of course, the Acropolis up on the hill, now converted into a temple, which we're going to talk about a little bit later today. So the Agora became the center of this democratic experiment, but it was also eventually bustling with all these occasional activities like markets being held, religious ceremonies, sports games, and even theater performances. Before a proper stone theater was built on the Acropolis's southern slope, the Agora served as this kind of impromptu theater venue. But on the west side here were the government buildings, were the administrative buildings for discussing and voting on different topics in the running of the government. So you had buildings for discussing military policy, foreign relations, and local law, for instance. The royal stoa here served as the office of the magistrate, elected for a one-year term, usually from the aristocracy, so kind of like our White House serves as an office for our president. But of course, stoas in general were these open porticos lined with columns, or buildings open with columns on just one side, and these lined the Agora's edges, and they really just provided flexible meeting spaces and these kind of sheltered areas for any less formal gatherings that might go on. For instance, grammarians might teach grammar to Athenian boys here, philosophers might groom their students in another, markets might be held in another, a court session where people were tried for breaking the law might be held in another, and a celebratory feast for a political figure held in another. The idea, the overarching idea was that the Agora itself put the running of the government on display for the participation of the citizens, and held public buildings free of use for any needs of the citizens. This really was very much the first step architecturally towards creating spaces for encouraging equality and equal opportunity for citizens of a state, at least in this case, male citizens. The painted stoa, for instance, that you see here was one of these better surviving flexible meeting places and celebrated a victory over the Persians within its walls. These were usually vibrantly painted with pro-Athenian propaganda. So, these public spaces and colonnaded buildings in Athens really set the standard for Greek cities around the Aegean, always containing the big three most important elements in any Greek city: the agora, classical temples, and Greek theaters. This is really how you recognize a classical period Greek city. And in the 5th century BC, the Greek colonies in Turkey and Italy adopted these elements, these agoras, classical temples, and Greek theaters, but also adopted a grid pattern to very efficiently organize land and guide the city's structure and growth from these cities that were really starting from scratch. So, while the idea of this orthogonally planned city came really from the Egyptians and the Harappans, the Greeks perfected it for their colonial cities. They used what they called per strigas, which means by bands, organizing cities with a few east-west avenues that divided the land into these long strips. And then these strips were further subdivided into rectangular urban blocks, each containing 6 to 10 building lots. So, for instance, in the 470s BC, the Athenians rebuilt their Miletus colony in Turkey after it was destroyed in the Persian Wars, and this new city plan used 3 differently sized grids over this uneven seaside terrain, but imposing a very strict grid on this uneven terrain. Initially, a perfectly rectangular agora, really equivalent to 30 city blocks, was formed, and the rest of the city was to be built around this. And they started with this L-shaped stoa and eventually added colonnaded courtyards, plazas, fountains, and temples, creating this lively sequence of public spaces in the center of the city. Priene, another Athenian colony in Turkey, was rebuilt a century later, and from the start, its public spaces, its agora, was designed as, of course, colonnaded outdoor rooms, and even the theater and temple to Athena were strategically placed within these standard blocks laid out for the city. And the hillside location added these amazing, breathtaking views, with the theater overlooking the sea, overlooking the temple, and the temple overlooking the agora, right? So, these Athenian colonies, in essence, were kind of constructed with all the amenities to govern themselves, meaning a small but fully functional agora at the center for running local government, a theater for entertainment, and a large temple for petitioning patron gods. Usually in Athenian colonies, this was Athena. And so these colonies typically had growth targets, so they would lay out the streets first, and the houses would be built into the framework. So let's zoom in a little bit. In Greek cities, especially colonial cities, the oikos, or the household, was the basic building block, reflecting the idea that a well-governed city starts with well-organized households. And so Greek colonial houses were typically very comfortable but very simple, without distinct architectural features. These are called row houses, and they're especially built in the colony, really showing a society of equals. So these houses were really typically 1 or 2 stories and centered always around a south-facing courtyard with a well and an altar to family gods. Service areas were on the shorter sides, like a kitchen, a storeroom, perhaps a family shop, and the andron, the men's dining room, for the man of the house to entertain friends and clients while reclining on couches. Usually situated at the very front of the house to, not really muddle into family affairs towards the back of the house. In this way, the man of the house could host parties and business deals without, awkwardly having to meet the family or interrupt the chores of the women and children of the house. While the living spaces and bedrooms were in these larger 1 or 2 story sections at the back. And then finally, this colonnaded veranda called the pastas wrapped around the interior of the courtyard, providing these kind of naturally shady garden for moving between the rooms. So I think the next step is talking about the counterpart to houses, which are the temples. And Greek temples are these iconic structures recognized by all, and they're usually designed, as I'm sure you know, in this oblong shape, this rectangle shape, surrounded by all the way around by stone columns, with the temple itself, the precinct of the temple itself, in the middle. They have this thick horizontal entablature and these triangular pediments, and they're often located in remote non-urban areas, right? These temples kind of serve as landmarks connected to the gods of Greek legends. A lot of temples are supposed to mark sacred sites where the gods came down and interacted with humanity, or where the gods made their magic, their presence known. But there's also temples in cities that have the main purpose of storing treasuries of sacred images and, most importantly, the city's economic surplus. These are double functioning as the city's treasury. Because where better to store your treasury than in a holy site which no one will touch? So a lot of these treasury temples had the temple in the front, and then about 3/4 of the way back a wall was put in and the treasury was stored behind in a sort of secret room. And believe it or not, these temples in the Mycenaean era were mostly made of wood, and the shift from, wooden to stone temples happened gradually over time. Early Mycenaean temples looked like these kind of narrow apsidal Megaron houses with steep roofs and entry porches. The design with the columns on all sides developed really between the 10th and the 7th centuries BC. And, the Doric temple design, the first reached its peak with the Temple of Hephaestion in Athens in 449 BC. But Doric and Ionic columns reflected regional preferences, right? So the Doric style was popular on the mainland and in the western colonies, while the Ionic style was favored on the west coast of Turkey and the Aegean Islands. And so let's just talk a little bit about these two different temple styles, both originating within the Aegean ancient Greek world and its colonies. So the really easy way to tell the difference between the two temple types of ancient Greece is just by looking at the columns. It gets more complicated than this, but the Doric order has these broad rounded capitals at their tops, while the Ionic columns had capitals with these kind of graceful volutes that curled down on both sides of the shaft. And very quickly, it's useful to know the details and differences between these orders, because for hundreds of years after this, these orders were followed to a T, to the extent that, in, say, the Renaissance period, if you wanted to build a church with, say, Ionic columns, you always built the corresponding entablature and pediment. These are also useful to know because, if you're looking at a genuine ancient Greek temple, you'll generally know whether it's from the Western Aegean or Eastern Aegean based on the order that it follows. But looking at the entire Doric order first, these Doric columns rose directly from the temple's platform, right, with no column base like the Ionic would have had, and featured these fluted shafts, these shafts with, grooves cut out of them. And, the Doric frieze, the decorative bit under the roofline, had these sculpted panels that, alternated between these three vertical grooves and what's called metopes, these, depicted figures or symbols from religious narratives. And then finally, a triangular pediment above the frieze carried some kind of sculptural composition, often, representing scenes again from Greek mythology or religious stories. In the Ionic order, like you see here with the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the columns again had a unique look. They rose from a slightly bulging column base and had these slender shafts, usually with a lot of flutes as well. But the capitals of these columns, as I said, had these kind of elegant volutes that curled down on both sides. Ionic temples typically had three plain, slightly corbelled bands with a continuous carved frieze just above them. And then the cornice was decorated with these kind of tooth-like dentils, adding to its distinctive style. And an honorable mention was this third order, not seen much at the time. The Romans used the Corinthian order much more than did the Greeks and really popularized it, but it was invented in this ancient Greek period. And so this third order, the Corinthian, essentially had its capital carved with rows of acanthus leaves, and its pillars were more often than not left unfluted. And finally, of course, Greek temples would have been adorned with vibrant colors. The columns were typically left unpainted, but the rough stone texture was usually always concealed with a layer of stucco, and even the smooth marble columns were waxed to enhance their brilliance in the Greek sunlight. Friezes were often painted with striking blues and reds, and even the sculptures in the pediments received colorful paint to enhance their visual impact. The big reason why a lot of the classical revival buildings in the Renaissance and later in the 1800s left their revival of Greek and Roman architecture uncovered was because the temples which they witnessed that survived appeared to have no paint. And so they reasoned that they had no paint originally. This is really because many temples after the spread of Christianity were sacked, taken apart to build churches, and the rare survivors were cleansed with holy water and turned into churches themselves. Even the Parthenon here was converted into a church in the 6th century AD, and in early Christian churches, decoration was really only prioritized on the inside, right? They obviously had no desire to touch up these pagan monuments with their paint fast fading, and so they were merely used a lot of times as platforms and buttresses for churches in the case of the Parthenon here, and you can see this in this reconstruction. And lastly, I want to talk about, I think, the most interesting thing about the architecture here, how a lot of these temples were actually optical illusions, which quite a lot of people don't know about. They are made to look a lot bigger and a lot more geometrically perfect than they really appear. For instance, when you look at a perfectly straight horizontal line in the real world, your brain might make it look like it's bending slightly. This happens obviously because of perspective. Things seem to shrink at the edges of your view. But the Greeks, of course, wanted to correct this because they believed they needed perfect spaces to house their heavenly gods. For them, optical perfection was much more important than geometric perfection. It was all about spiritual perfection. So to fix this illusion, they made the temple platform curve gently toward the center by an inch or two, and this tiny adjustment actually helped keep what should have been straight lines from even looking bent. The Doric columns, on the other hand, were tapered and had a slight convex bulge to look perfectly straight, right? So when you look at a straight column, it can seem to taper in the middle or kind of have a small waist. So the Greeks designed them this way to counteract that effect. And finally, all of the columns were actually very slightly tilted inward to create an optical illusion that made the building look much more grand and imposing from the ground. You have to imagine all of these temples would have been viewed all the way from the ground, all the way from the lowest possible vantage point. So this tilt made the building seem much taller than it actually was because the columns had to be higher to achieve this effect, right? So the tops of the columns always looked much farther from their bases when they were slightly tilted inward. Most of these refinements were so subtle that you might not notice them, but they really added to the overall beauty of the architecture. Now, I'm going to give you quite an in-depth overview of the origin and architecture of the Acropolis at Athens because it's the single most famous monument of Greece, and I think it's important for any art history student to know, as this was not the only Greek temple complex to exist. And I think it's a good lead-in to get you thinking about the architectural expression of religions, which is one of my all-time favorite topics to go on about, and something that we're going to talk a lot more about in this class. So Athens became really the dominant city in Greece by the late 500s BC, with a population of around 32,000, half of whom lived within the city walls. And during the Persian Wars, Athens formed alliances with other Greek cities, leading to the establishment of what's called the Delian League around the 470s BC. Athens became a very powerful leader in this league, amassing a formidable arsenal, a strong navy, and an efficient administrative system. And Athens essentially functioned like an imperial capital, receiving tribute from nearly 300 Aegean city-states that were part of this league. This newfound wealth was invested in constructing the Parthenon. And in 480 BC, the Persians actually sacked Athens, causing significant damage to the temples on the Acropolis. Initially the Athenians chose to leave the ruins as they were, considering them a memorial to those who perished during the Persian invasion, but after 2 decades, the renowned orator Pericles successfully persuaded the assembly to embark on the reconstruction of the Acropolis. And so this decision was motivated by a desire to kind of restore the city's glory and pay homage to the goddess Athena, credited with securing the alliance's victories over keeping Persia at bay. And so the new temples built on the Acropolis, which you see here, were a focal point for various religious ceremonies during the yearly festival of the Parthenia. This festival included competitions of poetry, music, and athletics, which were democratically judged, and all these events took place in the agora and spaces beneath the hill, which we've previously talked about. This festival finally reached its climax in a procession to the Propylaea, the gate leading to the Parthenon itself. After passing through the Propylaea, high priestesses presented a sacrificial offering, goats and sheep, to be slaughtered in the central court on the outdoor altar, and a long woolen tunic woven by 4 noble girls, which was to be wrapped around the ancient wooden statue of Athena Polia inside the Achaemenid, a temple located to the north of the Parthenon. Now, the Propylaea, the entrance, the gateway to the Acropolis itself, kind of resembled a 6-column Doric temple, but it was hollow on the inside. It was an entrance gate, and the space between the 2 central columns was extended to about 3 modules. And, obviously this allowed for the arrival of very large crowds of Athenians with animals for sacrifice during festivals, right? The rear facade presented even another Doric temple front, but obviously with shorter, squatter columns to adjust for a 2-meter elevation difference. And then the forecourt of the Propylaea had these 2 unequal wings. The left wing led to a dining hall and a public art gallery, while the right wing led to this small temple with Ionic porches dedicated to Athena Nike in celebration of the Delian League's eventual victory over the Persians. Nike means victory. Upon passing through the Propylaea, you would be greeted by this complex of buildings, and interestingly, none of the Acropolis buildings shared alignments. They were deliberately positioned without a common orientation. And surprisingly, the primary entrances of both major temples, the Erechthelion and the Parthenon, were at the rear, contrary to the typical east-facing orientation of Greek temples. This compelled visitors to walk between them, fully immersing themselves in the grandeur. The pediments of both temples were treated as massive sculpture pieces heavily adorned with full statues. The east pediment on the Parthenon showcased Athena's birth in intricate detail, depicting her fully formed, springing from the brow of her father, Zeus, and the west pediment told the captivating story of the intense rivalry between Athena and Poseidon, the god of the sea, because on the north side of the Acropolis, an olive tree associated with Athena grew out of a spring of Poseidon, signifying her triumph over the sea god for the city and their rivalry for city patronage. To the Greeks, strange things like olive trees growing out of sacred springs dedicated to Poseidon were monumental whispers of what was going on in the world of the gods, and could completely rededicate temples in the area and rename cities. But in this case, it's probably the Athenians kind of imposing myth onto their past. It's likely their city was always named Athens, and the goddess Athena was just named after the city. And finally, the low-relief frieze around the lintel depicted legendary battles, each holding significance in Athenian national pride, right? So these battles included the Lapiths against the Centaurs, the Greeks against the Amazons and Trojans, and the Olympian gods battling against the giants. These really were metaphors for Greeks versus the Persians. The Greeks loved using mythological metaphors to symbolize modern battles. So during the Pan-Athenian festival, these massive bronze doors of the Parthenon would be swung open, revealing the breathtaking 12-meter tall statue of Athena Parthenos, and the goddess was adorned in elaborate military attire carved from elephant ivory and gilded in gold. In her right hand, she held the image of victory, while her left hand rested on a formidable shield entwined with a snake. And the interior of the temple featured 2 levels of Doric columns surrounding the statue on 3 sides, and the Parthenon had these dual back-to-back cellars. The smaller one housed the treasury of the Delian League and was held up by 4 Ionic columns on the interior. The use of the Ionic order within this treasury actually symbolized Athens' newfound wealth derived from its Ionic dependencies. The Erechtheion, the smaller temple across from the Parthenon, was kind of a complex of temples that housed the tomb of King Erechtheus, the founder of Athens, also Athena's wooden cult statue open to the public at all times, and finally that sacred spring and olive tree of Athena we just talked about. But surrounding Athena's wooden cult statue were the Caryatids, these 6 sculpted maidens carrying an entablature on their heads, and they were all dressed like the high priestesses of the festival. So, they were intended to kind of represent the young women in stone so they could protect the goddess for eternity. So why is the Parthenon so destroyed if it is so beloved even today? Believe it or not, it wasn't just the march of time. There are still much better surviving ancient Greek temples. Well, as I said, in the 7th century, it was turned into a church, with a church essentially built inside of it, but it was still largely intact with its paint worn off. The real damage actually came much more recently in the Mauryan War. In just 1686, the Venetians bombarded the Pantheon with cannon fire, and an estimated 700 cannonballs hit the building's western facade. Meanwhile, the defending Ottomans were using the Parthenon as a munitions dump, and so after 3 days of shelling, a mortar struck the Parthenon and detonated the massive amount of gunpowder they were storing inside, and so the explosion ended up blowing the roof and destroyed the long sides of the temple. It also blew out 28 columns, so this is why the Parthenon seems like such a ruin today. So after Athens' decline following its defeat by Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars, the Parthenon really took on a new symbolic significance. For Alexander the Great, who eventually led Greek-speaking armies to conquer an even greater empire than the Persians, the Parthenon symbolized Greek cultural superiority. Alexander passionately promoted Greek culture and architecture throughout his quest to unify the known world under his rule, spreading Greek culture far and wide. Despite his origins in backwater Macedonia, Alexander's 15-year campaign took him from Egypt to Babylonia as he absorbed the old Persian Empire, though he fell just short of conquering India. But on his quest, he transformed democratic architecture and urban planning of the ancient Greeks into tools for his imperial rule, gaining a deified status among the Eastern rulers. His Hellenistic empire combined Greek city-states with autocratic regimes, and ruler worship became common practice, especially in the soon-to-develop Roman Empire, who were massively inspired by Alexander's Greek Empire. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his top generals into 3 Hellenistic states: Ptolemaic Egypt and Palestine, Seleucid Mesopotamia, and Antonid Aegean, each ruled by different dynasties, all of them semi-autonomous. After founding the new city of Alexandria at the delta of the Nile in Egypt, Alexander the Great established at least 70 other cities with the same name, named in his honor. And Alexandria's urban plan followed the Greek colony model with a rational grid of long blocks. The main street, the Canopus, ran parallel to the coast, dividing public areas from princely zones near the shore. And the city's center, of course, included an agora, though not one that supported democracy, also a temple, a precinct for Alexander's mausoleum, and a Greek theater overlooking the sea. So you can see already just how Alexander's conquests have begun to Hellenize, to Greekify Egypt. Finally, we arrive at our last topic today, which is Emperor Ashoka and the First Indian Empire and the first spread of Buddhism, really. And it ties in very nicely with our last lecture. So, Alexander the Great expanded his empire to really modern day Punjab, but didn't conquer India, as I said, instead establishing new cities there, 3 actually with his name, which you can see here. And Greek influence ended up persisting in the region for centuries. But after Alexander the Great's death, leaders in India actually united the lands east of Taxila, forming the Mauryan dynasty. And while the Mauryan rulers adopted the political structures from Persian and Greek empires, they didn't create enduring architectural wonders, none that we find today at least. But new religions, notably Buddhism, emerged during this period, promoting the construction of new memorials and monasteries. The founding Mauryan emperor, Chandragupta, famously met Alexander sometime before taking power in 320 BC. And believe it or not, the Mauryans even had frequent diplomatic relations with Alexander the Great's generals, exchanging military equipment and elephants for some of their territory. But Indian society at the time had come to form a very rigid caste system, with the Brahmin caste dominating the others. It included nobles above warriors, above farmers, above merchants, above workers, with untouchables at the bottom. Meanwhile, Buddhism was arising in the region, seeking to kind of topple a lot of this, and Chandragupta's grandson, named Ashoka, ruled for 37 years and finally turned to Buddhism after the Battle of Kalinga, where a massive loss of life, up to 100,000 reported slain, deeply affected him. And so he adopted Buddhist principles promoting nonviolence, consensus, tolerance of all religions and opinions, respect for elders and priests, generosity, and fair treatment of slaves. And so Ashoka really implemented his ethical ideals through his actions, like restoring roads and hostels, founding hospitals, and banning animal sacrifices and slaughter. So Ashoka ended up setting up 256 pillars all across his empire to spread Buddhism to travelers and promote social harmony. So the inscriptions on these pillars were in local languages, Sanskrit and even Greek in the western provinces, and essentially they shared Buddhist values like tolerance, respect for elders and priests, generosity, and fair treatment of slaves. This was how Ashoka was going to peacefully spread Buddhism to his empire, to his subjects. But the main thing I want you to take away from Mauryan India are the Buddhist stupas, because they're really the first monuments of Buddhism and the most defining for the ages. They appeared in every region Buddhism spread to, taking on slightly different architectural forms. So, for instance, we're going to see them again when we talk about China. So Ashoka built this monumental stupa near the pillar at Sarnath, and while ancient accounts say he built over 84,000 stupas, really only a few can be reliably linked to him. But a Buddhist stupa, is basically a mound containing Buddhist relics at its most base, meant to, encourage pilgrimages of the faithful, meant to encourage when they get there meditation, prayer, and kind of circumambulating rituals, which we'll get to. But Ashoka planned this one as a reliquary for some of the Buddhist ashes. It is the oldest stupa surviving in India. Other stupas house relics of Buddha's close disciples, influential monks, or even some sacred Buddhist artifacts or texts. So you can kind of think of them as very similar to reliquaries in Christianity, containing, say, fragments of the true cross, or fragments of body parts of saints. It's the same idea here in Buddhism. So originally Ashoka Stupa was this very simple mound made of just brick and rubble, but it was later expanded. Pilgrims added fences, gates, decorative finials, and symbolic sculptures. And so over time, more stupas were added containing ashes of the Buddhist's close disciples, and even 2 Buddhist monasteries were built around the grounds. But how this works is these circular railings surrounded a processional paths for pilgrims to walk around the stupa, get as close as they can to the relics, kind of glean some of the holiness from these relics. And these railings kind of just provided a screen for the path of the pilgrims and allowed kind of glimpses through the narrow gaps between the cross stones to the mound that allowed you to get close as you would in your life to the body of the Buddha himself. And then a split staircase led to this middle level of more fences, allowing only priests and monks to get even closer to the relics. These would have been very privileged positions for the religious caste to get up to. And then finally at the top there was this inaccessible square balustrade surrounding a 3-tiered sandstone Bodhi tree, and this tree obviously symbolized the presence of Buddhist relics inside the stupa because it represented the moment of enlightenment under the Bodhi tree of Siddhartha Gautama, who would become the Buddha. After Ashoka's rule, though, the Mauryan dynasty started losing control very fast over their empire, and India fragmented into smaller feudal states, and so by 185 BC, new dynasties had taken over the capital. But despite all of this political chaos, Buddhism continued to thrive, and we're going to see it again very soon.